Jesus says, keep awake. Do you have a story of coming to church and wondering if you're going to be able to stay awake through the sermon? Have you seen it happen to yourself and others, maybe? One of my favorite stay awake during the sermon stories involves, well, let's call him Lucky, because that was his name. Lucky heard that a famous preacher was coming to town. We'll call him Preacher Paul, even though that wasn't really his name. Preacher Paul was coming. Lucky heard there was going to be a great sermon. Though he probably worked a couple of shifts already that day, he showed up. And yes, around dinner time, Preacher Paul started his sermon. And he preached and preached and preached and preached. It was pretty tough for Lucky to stay awake. The place was packed. There were flickering lights that kind of lulled him to being more soporific, more sleepy. And finally, around midnight, he just lost it. He was even sitting in a window to try to keep the fresh air, keeping him awake. But around midnight, his head jerked to the side, or perhaps he actually convulsed a little bit, and he fell right out of the window. And unlucky for Lucky, he was in the third story. So he hit with a hard crash. People rushed to the window, looked out, and they said, he's dead. Lucky's dead. Preacher Paul wasn't ready to give up on him, and he rushed down 3 flights of stairs and tackled Lucky. And looked up and said, he's still alive. He's risen from the dead. And Preacher Paul took Lucky, also known in Greek as Eutychus, up the stairs, and according to Luke, the gospel writer, in Acts chapter 20, Eutychus became a kind of a sign of staying awake, of being raised from the dead. Jesus says, keep awake. Is the Eutychus story Luke's chance to dig at Paul for preaching a little too long? Is it a warning to people who are listening to sermons to stay awake? Is it perhaps a smiling way of saying Jesus raises the dead? So Jesus says, keep awake. Keep watch. Attentiveness and vigilance are signs of God's inbreaking into the world. This morning I'm indebted to a couple of writers who have reflected a lot on what it is to gather for Advent. In a book, in an article entitled All is Calm in the Current Sojourner's Journal, Julian Davis Reed reflects on how, despite the busyness of Advent at Christmas time, we can hear Scripture's radical call to rest and stillness. So the good news as you hear this call to keep awake is that the first clue to staying awake is to get enough rest. In a season where it's so busy. So the first word that Julian Reed discovers as he listens to the story is that God speaks to Joseph during his sleep. Not once, but twice. And the call for us to stay alert, to stay awake, is to listen for God even in the most unexpected moments. So God says to Joseph, don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife, and call Jesus by that name because he shall save his people from their sins. And then later in Matthew's gospel, as the Magi are leaving, the messenger comes to Joseph again in his dreams and says, take the baby, take the mother, become refugees in Egypt. Stay awake to the needs the dangers around you. According to Reed, this is also a call for us to find sanctuary from violence, as Joseph did. How can this season of longer sleep help you better see the violence of our age? Maybe your sleep habits give you a perspective on others' lust for power. By choosing healthy rhythms of sleep, we can see how greed keeps others from doing so. The violent systems that keep people from sleeping regularly need to be dismantled. Stay awake. Rest produces more rest. And listening calls for an inner stillness as we become attentive, alert, eyes open, ears attuned to God's voice. The wakefulness that Jesus asks for, nothing other than the spiritual practice of paying attention. Barbara Brown Taylor's book, An Altar in the World, that book is available from the public library through an electronic checkout, so you can actually, without leaving your home, if you're a library patron, get a hold of Barbara Brown Taylor's book, An Altar in the World. She has a chapter called The Practice of Paying Attention. She says that anything can become a sacrament, an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual experience. To regard something properly is to pay attention, to practice that idea of keeping awake. She says it's as simple as looking twice at people that you might easily ignore. It's a different way of life, full of treasure for those who pay attention to exactly where we are. I invite you to commit to this spiritual practice of staying awake. See what happens as you travel through your neighborhood if you're attentive to things that you hadn't been watching before. See if it doesn't awaken in you a new spirit which had become casual to the world around us. See if it doesn't alert you to new ways that you see God working in the world. Melissa Bills is a pastor at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. She invites us to watch in this way. She says God's reign is found in the dancing of a candle flame, lighted in prayer at the end of the day. It's in the deep questions that come to us when we are frustratingly unable to stay asleep at night, in the wonder of the stars that rise at night. It is embodied by wearying ones dozing in hospital recliners beside loved ones who are sick or dying. Each day, Jesus whispers to us again, stay awake. God's kingdom will come and we will be ready to welcome it because we have been paying attention. We heard the prophet say in prayer to God, tear the heavens open and come down. Debbie Thomas, as she reflects on that word, says there is no prayer too small or too big as we think about paying attention, keeping our eyes open. If God is tearing the heavens open, do we have eyes alert to the great things that God may be doing in the world? And do we have eyes for the tiny things that are going around us. So this morning, I bid you with these prayer invitations. I bid you to be attentive to the violence and injustice that tears apart the people of Israel and Palestine. And I bid you to be attentive to the cashier who helps you buy your groceries. I bid you to be attentive to the unjust structures in Fresno, represented by redlining. And I bid you to be attentive to the coming and the going of your neighbor. I bid you to be attentive to the glorious sunrise and sunset of this season. And I bid you to be attentive to the rustling leaves beneath your feet. I bid you to be attentive to our congregation's mission, belonging, inquiring, transforming. And I bid you to listen for one restful word that comes from the hymn that we're about to sing.